Welcome to another episode of InstaBlinks. Today we are speaking with Kirk Roybal. Kirk is a long-time PostgreSQL DBA and architect, as well as a very well-known author and evangelist for this specific data technology. In this episode, we're going to focus the conversation on an increasingly popular migration path that enterprises are really addressing to look at reducing their costs and improving their data layer capabilities. And that is the migration of Oracle to PostgreSQL. So Kirk, thank you so much for joining us, mate.
Thank you, Timothy. Thank you for that really praising introduction. Glad to be here.
My pleasure. So Kirk, I guess before we get into the nitty gritty, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in the world of Postgres?
I was an unsuspecting software developer when Postgres was thrust upon me. Many years ago, I was actually a Visual Basic and SQL Server guy. It's almost a former lifetime now. And a customer asked me, this is back in 1998, a customer asked me to build a web application back when people barely knew what the heck internet meant. And so the SQL licensing and the software licensing from Microsoft hadn't really caught up with the concept of having to do worldwide service yet. And they said, hey, we can't afford $50,000 worth of processor and seat licensing in order to build an internet application. Can you go find us something else? So I was thrust into the world of the World Wide Web way back in early 98 when PostgreSQL had just become PostgreSQL. At that time, using it with ODBC and Visual Basic as a replacement for SQL Server. I've been at this now for 24 years, I guess.
24 years. You must have seen a lot of things in your time.
I kind of saw all of them for Postgres. Yeah, I've actually been in PostgreSQL long enough to actually meet a lot of the founders. You know, I was there kind of toward the end of the founder time when they were coming out of from Berkeley, from BSD, and they were had been working on things like set theory, and basically everybody in Postgres was mathematicians.
I guess digging into the topic of today's conversation, which is around the Oracle to Postgres migration and why enterprises are conducting these kind of migrations, at great popularity. Can you maybe just give us a quick overview from your experience in a lot of these migrations, why PostgreSQL can be a better database option in comparison to Oracle?
Of course, the obvious answer to the question would be cost. The price of free is very attractive, and free, as we know, is a great keyword. But a little bit beyond that, to give it a little bit more thorough treatment than that, would say that it has to do with the robustness of the features, the maturity of the product, the availability of all the extensions, the community around it, and the ability that we've discovered over time, especially through Instaclustr, that open source beats closed source, and people really wanted to have the freedom of being able to see the source code, be able to diagnose their own problems, and contribute to the community, and not just be a consumer, but a contributor to what they were working with. So there's a lot of motivations to move to PostgreSQL beyond just cost, although that is certainly a big driver. And of course, there's the obvious that drives the cost, which is licensing and the ability to drive up as many servers as you need. So in the PostgreSQL world, you get used to the idea of having complete freedom to do what you want to do, drive up as many servers as you want to drive up, and you don't have to call a sales guy in order to do it.
Absolutely. So look, as the Postgres guru, and I know you've written books on Oracle to Postgres, as best you can you talk to me a little bit about some of the key considerations businesses need to assess and look at when migrating their databases from Oracle to Postgres?
Well, certainly there's the things that are simply mechanical, like the complexity of the procedures, the amount of data, the complexity of the tables. Do the data types that you're using in Oracle actually exist in PostgreSQL? Is there a better way to philosophically do things in PostgreSQL? So those are kind of the mechanical answers. But there's also stuff like your architecture above that. Are you using RAC? Are you using forms? Are you using any of the software development toolkits that Oracle provides? And how are you going to actually model that kind of thing into the PostgreSQL world? It's not just a matter of data. It's actually a complete ecosystem that's coming with it. it's good to think of it in terms of a complete ecosystem moving along, rather than to just say, how do I data dump my data from Oracle to PostgreSQL? It's not quite that simple of a procedure. So and then above that, you have the training cost, and that is, I have Oracle people, I don't have PostgreSQL people. And the answer to that is, well, maybe you have more than you think, because PL SQL and PLPG SQL are not that different. So you have some people that actually can understand procedures. PostgreSQL also uses MVCC, the multi-version concurrency control, and the same general philosophy that Oracle does, although not quite the same implementation. And that you can actually bring in the expertise you need, because you might have more expertise on tap than you think you do. That being said, we already alluded a little bit to, who are you going to call? When you run into a problem, if I don't have a specific vendor, who am I going to actually get to service this? And the great answer in PostgreSQL land right now is that nearly everybody who's ever worked on PostgreSQL from its inception to the present is still around somewhere in the community, and you can just talk to them directly. So you don't have to guess at how the internals of anything function. And so one of the things that you say, when you talk about what are your considerations, I guess the consideration is mindset. Ultimately, how do I actually think of things in an open source world, and how do I think of things in a PostgreSQL world? Not how do I convert my concept from Oracle to PostgreSQL. That's only half of the journey. And if you think of things in those terms, you'll never speak Postgres.
So going back to the business mindset, I guess any change, right? When we're talking about migrating from Oracle to Postgres, particularly, every change, even if you're going from a paid license model to a free, there's a cost involved, right? And as you said, you've got assets, you've got expertise there that are Oracle guys, that now you need to train them up in Postgres, and there are other change costs as well associated with it. Do you have any sort of back of the napkin kind of calculations around, or just some general rules of thumb about what the ROI period looks like with these types of migrations? What sort of payback period? How long does it kind of take to start realizing some net gains from these types of transitions?
Right. To answer that, I have to go back a little bit to your earlier question about, what do you need to know in order to start this migration? And part of that has to do with complexity. Those first few physical things we were talking about. If all you were using Oracle for was a stupid data bucket, then of course your ROI is going to be nearly immediate. The payback is going to be virtually nil, because you weren't using any of the capabilities of Oracle anyway. But as things become more complex, and they very much do, because Oracle has been around for several decades as well as Postgres, and these installations tend to become much more mature than that. They do depend on a lot more of the features. They do end up having a little bit more of the proprietary tools involved beyond just the database itself. And those things tend to be the things that ends up costing more, and therefore taking more amortization and time in that ROI. So I know this may sound a little bit glib, but everybody estimates 3 years and takes 5, right? Because they estimate it to take 3 years of development time in order to make the switch. They end up taking a little more than they think, because they don't realize exactly how many concepts they don't know. So it's kind of a Rumsfeldian thing. You don't know what you don't know until you find out what tools you're not going to have when you get there. Right.
It all depends. That makes a lot of sense, right? Like everything in technology. So I guess when organizations get to the point where they've done the assessment, they've worked with the likes of Instaclustr to look at what some of the changes might need to be made in terms of using proprietary towards, Postgres, compatible services, and they're at the point where they want to pull the trigger on the migration. Are there any tools or migration coding assistance tools that you'd recommend using when organizations are at that point?
The active words there are coding assistant. If you understand that the coding assistants are only going to do about 40% of the job at best, and you walk into them with the understanding that they really are just trying to be a time saving, and it's kind of it's a chalk outline. It says, put your application here. And put your database structure here, put your code here, right? Because they don't have the ability to really come anywhere close to the real mechanics it would take to translate one grammar of language into another grammar of language. What you're talking about there is almost as complex as Google Translate or something, because ultimately you can express yourself as well as you can in a computer language, as much as you can express yourself in a human language. And so the coding complexity becomes fairly large heuristic very quickly. And making that transition from one to the other is nowhere near the level of finesse that something like Google Translate has. So if you understand that, so the expectation here may be the way that commercial products work that have had decades to work on and hundreds of people working on them. And in reality, the actual coding assistants out in the PostgreSQL land have had a few, individuals working on them over a few years. And so the level of maturity is about that level. So let's get real about what they can do. And then the answer would be yes, go ahead and use Aura to PG and go ahead and use things like Aura FCE. And those projects will give you probably about 60 or 70. Aura FCE will give you maybe 60 or 70% of the API that Oracle has in PostgreSQL. And Aura to PG will give you maybe 30 or 40% of the language translation of your functions and things. And that'll be enough to actually get you off the dime and maybe give you some suggestions of some things that you wouldn't have thought of by yourself, not being a PostgreSQL expert already. So in some ways, it helps the developers learn what they're doing more than it really gives you a completed code outline. And so because those are the things that people have thought to actually translate. And that can be a great learning experience. But don't by any means expect them to produce finished code. They're not anywhere close.
So who do they? Well, I guess what's the missing piece there? Like, there's obviously a big gap between what these tools can provide and where organizations need to be to complete a successful migration. So what's the missing piece?
Consulting. There really isn't any substitute in this case for an actual expert. Somebody has to know what the objective was and what right means, and they preferably an expert who understands coding by testing. Test first coding and test suite development, because you are going to need to find out that your code still does what you think it does, and to have any confidence in that, it's really going to end up being expert level test driven development.
Absolutely. So Kirk, just as a final question, being the experienced practitioner you are of these types of migrations, are there any last bits of advice or limitations, challenges that you would like to outline to the audience interested in these types of migrations?
There's a certain normal human tendency to try to minimize how complex something is going to be. And this is something that has helped humans over the years. It doesn't help humans when it comes to Oracle to PostgreSQL migration. You want to take the large scale nature of a migration seriously and actually deal with the details of the development. And it makes more sense to meet that head on and understand that that's going to happen than to try to minimize and then get surprised. You'll ultimately be more satisfied with the migration when you're not kidding yourself about how long it takes, how complex it's going to be, whether or not you're really going to need expert help and consulting over it. And then when you do get there, you're going to feel like you own it because you're actually going to feel like you did something to get it. And so just go ahead and own it. Realize that that's going to be the way the new life works, and be more confident in the result because you made the right decision, not because you tried to minimize the damage.
That's a great bit of advice, Kirk. Mate, thank you so much for your time today. I know it's been a super quick overview, but you've shared some really valuable insights. So I very much appreciate your time, and hopefully we can get you back to chat on another episode soon.
Hopefully I've got something else to say that somebody might want to hear.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for watching. Until next time. Thank you.